Our guest on this edition of CityWide is Carl Weisbrod, president of Trinity Real Estate, a director of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and the Trust for Governor's Island. Formerly, he was president of the Downtown Alliance and also president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ken.
In a variety of capacities, you have been involved with some of the largest development and redevelopment projects in the city over the course of the years. Is it particularly hard to build big things in New York?
I think it's particularly hard to build big things in any major complex urban environment. You know, the average major development in this country in an urban setting takes about 25 years to build. It's hard to imagine. I really got my start, and probably the thing that I've been involved in that I'm proudest of is the redevelopment of Times Square. And here we're sitting here in October 2010. I started working in Times Square in 1978, and we're about a month away from the opening of the last building in the Times Square area. So that's 32 years. We all think of Times Square as a major success and a major turnaround in the city, and it is, but it really took a very, very long time to see it come to fruition. And I think sometimes we're a little impatient in the city, given the complexity of getting these big projects done, to get them done quickly.
But it also, it seems that, and now in particular, that there are many people who can say no and very few people who can say yes.
I think it's very hard to put together coalitions. I'm not sure it's any harder now than it was 30 years ago. It is a lot harder now than it was 50 years ago, in the days of Robert Moses, when Robert Moses could just about build anything he wanted whenever he wanted and could ride roughshod over anything, whether it was a good idea or not. And many of his ideas, as we know, were very good, and some of them weren't so good. But I think we're probably better off as a city and as a society that there are a wide range of views that are brought to thinking about a development. I think about, in a different context entirely, China and India. And I think now India is likely, its economy is likely to outstrip China in the years to come. And even though one is an authoritarian state and one isn't. And we sometimes look at China yearningly, but I'm not sure that we would like that model.
So you were involved with the Lower Manhattan in a couple of capacities, not just as a director of the state corporation that was put together, but also at the time of the September 11th attack, you were the representative of the property owners and businesses in Lower Manhattan. So as you look back over the last decade since then, what do you think went right, and what do you think maybe should have been done in a different way?
Well, in general, I have to say, and I've said this for the last probably 5 years, that as I looked at the devastation in Lower Manhattan on September 12th, 2001, and I personally saw the second plane go into the World Trade Center and watched in horror, as we all did, as both buildings came down and devastation was cast over a very wide area. And for weeks, those of us who lived in New York at that time remember what it was like, with the National Guard patrolling Lower Manhattan, with essentially needing a passport to come south of Canal Street. I think for all of us who lived through that period, for all the loss of life and all the devastation, all the tragedy that went on, when we think about where we are today, I think on September 12, 2001, I would not have imagined that we would be in as good a shape in Lower Manhattan as we are today. I think Lower Manhattan has come back remarkably quickly. And in general, I think we have a lot to be grateful for. I think the World Trade Center site has proceeded perhaps more slowly than people would like, but again, you know, thinking of the sweep of development projects, major development projects in the city over the last half century, to go from the devastation we saw on September 11th to rebuilding where we are today, I think that's actually quite expeditious. So I'm fairly pleased.
I want to ask you about Lower Manhattan, not so much about the Ground Zero specifically, but the mix of uses and people in Lower Manhattan seems to have changed quite a bit. If you go back, Jane Jacobs, the mother of modern urbanism, she was complaining about the lack of diversity and the lack of interesting things to do, and that's why businesses were leaving, back in the 60s when she was writing about it. But clearly, before the attack, there were very few tourists in the Wall Street area, except maybe if they were going to the Statue of Liberty. Now, you can't walk down a street on a Saturday without being full. There were no residents down there. Are these elements that are contributing to the business vitality, or are they just incidentals in filling up space that would otherwise be vacant because business really wants to be in Midtown?
It's a good question. I think our whole concept of what land use and planning ought to be has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. When zoning started, we compartmentalized uses. We had manufacturing in one place, we had residents living in another place, we had retail centers in a third place, entertainment in a fourth place, commercial activity in a fifth place. And the idea was these places had to be functional for one particular use. When I arrived in Lower Manhattan in 1994, it was 7 years before 9/11. The place was really in a depression economy. The vacancy rate was 30%, the commercial vacancy rate. There were some people living there, a few people living there in Battery Park City and a few other residential buildings. But the place really did close up at 9 o'clock at night. My favorite statistic is that in 1960, there were fewer residents in Lower Manhattan than were there in 1700. It's really remarkable. But we made a commitment, and it was a hard commitment for the business community at that time, to say this really has to be a mixed-use community, and we have to bring in residents. And residents did come in. A lot of new residential units were built, but mostly older commercial buildings were converted to residential use. And I think it's the residents who saved Lower Manhattan after 9/11, because although for a few weeks, not surprisingly, the residents all fled, they came back, partly because of a very dramatic program that the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation initiated, but largely because this was their home. And that's what stabilized Lower Manhattan and sort of, I think, created a marker for the business community to stay, grow, flourish. And I think as we'll see it, thanks in large measure to the World Trade Center site and to the new businesses that have made a commitment or are making a commitment to move down there, I think that this will be a stronger financial or commercial district, not necessarily financial, than it's been in the past.
So you're now, through Trinity, one of the major property owners in Lower Manhattan, or at least commercial properties in Lower Manhattan. Many people may not know what Trinity Real Estate is. So tell us what that is, but also how does the market look from the point of view of somebody who has to fill up buildings?
Well, Trinity Real Estate is unique because Trinity Church, which was established shortly after the British took over New York from the Dutch, and the Crown and the church were essentially one. Queen Anne in 1705 bequeathed to Trinity Church 215 acres of land in Lower Manhattan as an endowment, but also to some extent as a tool, because Trinity used some of that land to incubate many of our great institutions, Columbia University, New York Hospital, hundreds of others really. And when those institutions took hold, Trinity would give them the land, the institution would sell the land in Lower Manhattan as its endowment and move uptown. And so Trinity today has a small fraction of the land that it had 300 years ago, but we still have...
but it's worth a little bit more now.
It's worth a little bit more, and it's a good demonstration that investment in real estate in New York City is a pretty good investment indeed. But the land we own for the most part, except for our landmark churches, Trinity Church, St. Paul's Chapel, a few other religious sites in New York. For the most part, we're located in the Hudson Square area between Canal Street and Houston Street, from 6th Avenue to Greenwich Street. We own some property in Tribeca,
How much?
some in Soho. We own 6 million square feet of commercial real estate, and we've done very well, because one of the things that we've done over the years, we're doing well in the sense that our vacancy rates are down, but we've done well in the sense that over these 3 centuries, we've been a part of the city of New York, and we've seen our future as the city's future. We, at first, Trinity used a lot of this land for farmland, and later it became residential as the New Amsterdam village grew and moved uptown. Then it became manufacturing, and this was the old printing district. And recently, over the last 25 years, as the city's moved to a service economy, we've invested in our buildings and seen them converted to commercial use, and today we're really a media hub and a center for creative activity. And we've suffered like other property owners during the downturn of the last 2 years, but because of the kind of tenants we have, we think we're very, very, very well situated for the future. Because the future of the city, I think the future of the American economy is really creative businesses. That's what America does so well, and New York particularly does well.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the New York value proposition when CityWide continues right after this. Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Carl Weisbrod, president of Trinity Real Estate, civic activist involved with Lower Manhattan and Governor's Island. What is the New York City value proposition? Why should a global corporation choose to deploy its resources here as opposed to any city that we compete with?
I think we have the most creative, diversified urban economy in the world with the most creative and diversified workforce. And because we are a place which welcomes people from all over, perhaps more than any other urban area in the entire world, we have a workforce that is particularly suitable for an international global economy. And moreover, particularly suited because of the mix of uses that we have. It's a financial center, to be sure, but the role that culture and the arts plays here in attracting the talent that works in the business world is very, very important.
It's not that long ago that the mayor was arguing that if Congress clamped down too hard on the financial services sector, that business would go to London, and that the London regulatory, the English regulatory system was just more favorable for global finance. Although after the Lehman Brothers debacle and AIG, there were folks in London saying that they needed more regulation because investors didn't want to trust companies that were located in London. So if you just look, I guess they are our biggest English-speaking competitor, but how do the two of them stack up, and are there lessons we should be learning from what they do in London?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Immediately after September 11th, when all systems in Lower Manhattan were down, domestic trading and clearing operations in the United States or in New York went to London. It didn't go to Chicago or Tampa or wherever. And it did because that's where the workforce was. We sometimes think we have a foreign policy in New York, and I don't think we really do. We can control what we can control. And what we can control is our urban environment and making the city as attractive to talent as we possibly can. That's what London's doing. And on that level, we are competing. London has a certain advantage because, in terms of the regulatory environment, because London is without a doubt the major city in the UK, and the national government regulates. But they're regulating at least as tough as we are right now, and maybe even somewhat tougher. But I think the competition is ultimately for talent and where high quality talent wants to be.
So it's giving people places to live, work, and play.
Absolutely. And a very important point is that now when enticing talent to New York or to London or to any major city, to our international competition, Shanghai and Hong Kong, you're not just attracting an individual, you're usually also attracting that individual's spouse. And that individual spouse is no longer a stay-at-home mom or dad. That individual spouse is also a person of talent. And so the more diversified the economy is, the more likely it is that you can attract that couple, because one spouse may be an investment banker, the other spouse may be a world-class cellist. And how to attract both is often the challenge.
So let me give you a hypothetical. You have been involved to some extent in keeping your eye on Governor's Island for a very long time. And even back before the federal government, I think, had turned it over with
Yes.
the Urban Land Institute.
Yes.
So you've got not quite a blank slate, but you've got a very large amount of open space, which is a scarcity in New York. You've got 1 million square feet of historic buildings. You've got an incredible historic heritage associated with it that most Americans aren't familiar with, and the most amazing views, but it's tantalizingly in the middle of the water, and it's hard to get to, and it's hard to build anything on. So you're now one of the trustees of Governor's Island. What's the vision, and is it and are we going to be waiting for it for 25 years?
I don't think we'll be waiting for it for 25 years, but I do think that the board and the management of Governor's Island now is charged with coming up with a vision that I think has to achieve a few things. First of all, I think enormous progress, as you know, because you've been chair of the Governor's Island Alliance and have been such a great advocate for Governor's Island. There has been an enormous change in Governor's Island already. I mean, it has become a major attraction for New Yorkers, and if New Yorkers haven't been there to see the fabulous parks that have been created, they should go, because it's truly spectacular. But in order to make Governor's Island sort of a permanent jewel, we clearly have to create some uses that will support both a transportation infrastructure so that people can get there easily, and the transportation is paid for permanently, and enough activity there so that there's something to do throughout the year, and it doesn't just become a summer attraction. I think it has been elusive because of all the things you said. It is totally spectacular, and the potential is great. And I wish I could say to you today, here's the vision.
I'll draw it.
I'll draw it, or I'll state it. I'm not a very good drawer, but I'll state it. I think it's a challenge, given the constraints that we now have. I'm very happy, by the way, that the city is now overseeing it. Clearly, that's, I think, a better governance than having it jointly organized by both the city and state.
But let's talk about that just for a second. The mayor has 3 years left on his term, but unless they change the law again, this time it really is the clock running. There's going to be a new governor come January. The city seems to be doing well enough that it can take on projects like this in Brooklyn Bridge Park without state help. Upstate seems to be continuing to bleed. Are there big ideas that need to be on the table now, whether it's a big project or a big policy change, a big tax cut? Is there something that when the new governor and the new mayor meet for the first time in January, that they ought to be focusing on?
I think we're at a very unusual, perhaps unique time in the relationship between the city and the state. The city is always the creature of the state. We know that. At the same time, the city, as you also just noted, has its finances in pretty good order, and the state has no money. In fact, it has worse than no money. So before the state comes up with some big ideas, I think the state has to get its fiscal house in order. And that's really the first priority, I think, of the new governor. I think the city has traditionally turned to the state for both partnership and financial support, and in recent years, because of its own financial condition and basically being better off than the state, it's disentangled itself from the state. And I think that's going to stay that way for a while until the financial situation reaches equilibrium.
So you've announced that you're going to be leaving Trinity in short order. Your successor has been picked. It's somebody from inside the organization, which I guess is a tribute to your management to some extent.
It's a tribute to the continuity that Trinity has always displayed over 300 years.
So, you know, what's next, and are you going to be keeping your hand in civically?
I'm definitely keeping my hand in civically. I'm going to continue to serve on public boards and private organizations. I'm a great believer in the future of New York. I think this city is probably in better shape and has better potential than any other city on earth, and I want to be a part of it going forward for the rest of my life.
My thanks to Carl Weisbrod, president of Trinity Real Estate. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us on this edition of CityWide.